All right, let me make a correction. We're not talking about data analysis. We're talking about storytelling, ladies and gentlemen. That was my bad. My bad. All right, so today we got a remarkable guest who's on a mission to help entrepreneurs and business leaders become exceptional storytellers. So get ready for a deep dive into the world of strategic storytelling and communication. In this episode, he's going to unveil his proven 4-step strategic storytelling method known as COSA, COSA. And he's going to share how it transformed the communication skills of professionals like global giants like PepsiCo, MasterCard, and more. So let's welcome to the show, Mr. Cesar Castro. All right, Cesar, let's do this thing, man. Welcome to the show.
I'm pumped. I'm pumped with all the music, with the way you presented. I'm just super excited to be on here on the show.
Well, let's do this, man. First question I always ask is that everybody who comes on the show is here to promote something, to talk about what it is that they do, to get their message out, to sell their product or service. What is that for you?
For me, it's really simple. I am convinced and I have passion for helping other people become great storytellers, because I believe we can be better leaders, better entrepreneurs, better communicators if we become great storytellers. So I'm on that mission of just communicating to the world the importance that we all have to become better storytellers. And then obviously, if someone wants to become a better storyteller, then I also have certain methods and things to help them. But my main core conviction is just that the world will be better if we become better storytellers.
I heard something a long time ago, one of the earlier episodes that I ever did. By the way, you're episode 1291. So I've been doing this for a while, but very early on, somebody told me that facts tell, but stories sell. We as human beings tend to be emotional creatures. We buy everything on emotion and then we logically try to justify it. And that story that's told by whoever is selling a product or service, the better the story, the more likely it is someone is going to buy. So let me ask you, who is a perfect audience, the target audience, that perfect client of yours that wants to learn how to tell stories?
My perfect audience, the one that I usually work with, are business leaders, whether they be already in the corporate world and they're in leadership positions. One of the things that you start learning as you start moving up the corporate ladder, for example, is that the higher you get, the more important your communication skills become. There's actually studies that have been done through the Harvard Business Review that show that about 80 to 90% of what a leader does in his day-to-day is related to communication. And a lot of that communication is public communication, public speaking, or interpersonal communication, or now, digital communication. But everything we do is communication. So I always tell leaders, I'm like, look, if you were reading your job description and it said that 80, 90% of your job will be to communicate, you better be really good at that. Right. And myself as an entrepreneur, I have my training and consulting business. One of the things that has helped me the most to be able to move forward and work with these big, corporate giants is the fact that I know how to tell good stories. So I always tell entrepreneurs as well, the best way to differentiate yourself and to get your message to really stick in people's mind and their hearts is by knowing how to tell a good story. And usually in the business world, the businesses that can tell the best stories are the ones that usually win.
All right, what about those 4 steps? Because I know there's somebody out there who's like, look, I want to be a good storyteller, but for some reason, when I start telling a story, I start with the punchline and then I got to backtrack and then it never comes out right.
Yeah.
How do I get to the point where I can just confidently come in, tell a story, and really engage my audience, keep them into whatever it is that I'm talking about, or maybe even persuade them to go in a certain direction?
Yeah, so when it comes to storytelling, like if someone was to Google right now how to tell a story, they would probably find a lot of different methods and different steps. The most famous or the most iconic one that a lot of people use is the hero's journey, which is actually 21 steps to tell a good story. So the original father of that methodology, he was more into the world of movies. So it makes sense, obviously, if you're telling a 2-hour story, 21 steps. But in my case, since I'm working more in the business world, I can't go up to a manager in an organization and be like, look, I'm going to teach you 21 steps so you can tell a good story. The moment I say
where the door is at that moment.
Yeah, they'll be like, you know what? I don't have time for that. So what I've done through the years, and since I've been doing this teaching storytelling now for about 8 years, is I've been simplifying the process to 4 steps, because I think that anyone, when you go up to someone and be like, look, in 4 steps, you can create a good strategic story. Most people are like, yeah, give me that 4 step. Now, I do want to differentiate something very important here before I get into the 4-step method. There is a difference between just storytelling and what I do, which is called strategic storytelling. So storytelling is the art of communication through stories, right? And that's something that we actually all do. We as humans are storytelling creatures, and we've been telling stories for over 100,000 years. So most people, if you get them on the weekend with a good cup of wine or good beer, they'll tell pretty good stories, in the backyard with the friends, right? And most people, and the way that we as human beings communicate usually is by telling stories. We're not just speaking facts, or we don't get home at night and when our kids ask us, what did you do today? We don't pull out the PowerPoint presentation and start giving them, right? We usually tell a story. And that is just because we as human beings understand the world, and we try to communicate our world through stories. So storytelling is the art of doing that. And most people in some way or another can do it. Now, strategic storytelling, which is what I teach, is what I call the art of influence, because it's not just telling stories to communicate, it's telling stories as a strategic vehicle to make sure that your message or your idea that you're trying to get across to your team, to your customer, to your market hits, right? It impacts and creates change. So strategic storytelling is all about learning how to use stories that can ultimately generate some kind of change, whether that be in people's perceptions, people's feelings, or people's actions. And that is what I usually teach. So I always tell my clients, like, I'm not just going to teach you how to tell stories because you probably already know how to do that. I'm going to teach you how to create strategic stories. So that way you can make sure that your idea or your message really hits home when you're trying to influence someone to change actions, behaviors, feelings. Okay?
Yeah. And before we get into those 4 steps, I totally agree with you. I've always learned that whenever somebody's talking to a prospective client and you hear no, right, the objection no, usually it's not the NO that you're really having an issue with. It's that the other no, KNWO, that they didn't know enough information. And I think a good story here, a strategic story, will give them a new perspective, another idea, something they didn't quite see the first time that might change that no to a yes simply by having a strategy. So hit me with it. 4 steps that can help me change that no into a yes.
All right. So the reason why I and you read it, you talked about that at the beginning, the method is called COSA, all right, is because I originally taught this in Latin America. I'm from Chile. That's where I was born, in Latin America. And it's where I've been the last 20 years of my life. I grew up in the States, but I went back to Chile and fell in love with a beautiful Chilean woman and ended up staying there for a long time. And then I've been back about 2 years here in the States. So when I teach this method in Latin America, I say, this is la cosa más importante, or this is the most important thing, because cosa means thing in Spanish, that I'm going to teach you so you can create a strategic story. Now, at the same time, I'm being strategic and pedagogical, because when you remember the word cosa, you'll remember the 4 steps so you can create an effective story. The great thing is that those 4 steps can also be translated into English, and it also comes out with the word cosa. So the first step to be able to create a good strategic story, every strategic story starts out with what's called the context. Okay, the context. Now, context is still kind of a, what is that? But really, context is 3 questions that we have to answer at the beginning of our story. Where did it happen? When did it happen? And who did it happen to? Right? And all stories, and especially business stories, if you think about it, they all start like that. Right? We don't say once upon a time like we, with stories when we were kids, but we do say, hey, you know what? Like 2 weeks ago, right? I was in my office and I was talking to a member of my team. Did you notice what I just did? I just answered the 3 questions.
You told me where, you told me when, and you told me who.
Exactly. That is the context. And it's really important for us to always, when we start a story, create a context, because it allows your audience to start imagining, right? And start going into the story with you. Now, the objective, and this is crucial, every step or every stage of the 4-step process has an objective, has a goal, a purpose. The objective in the context is to create connection. What you want is your audience to connect quickly with the story And usually people connect quickly when you're able to take them to a place or sometime, or specifically when you're able to introduce characters into your story that people will resonate with. So we're always thinking, right, when you're creating a story, who your audience is, because you want to make sure that the characters that you have and that you're introducing in the context of your story are able to connect really quickly with the audience. All right. So, for example, if I'm speaking to entrepreneurs, right, I would tell a story about, and if it's a personal story, I would tell a story about, hey, you know what? 10 years ago, I was in the corporate world and I decided to become an entrepreneur, just like you. And the moment I do that, the moment I say entrepreneur, all the entrepreneurs that are listening are, oh, what? Yeah. Because in a way, what you're really doing is you're telling their story through yours. And this is something that actually hit me pretty hard when I understood it. And it's based on a psychological principle that people don't really want to listen to your story just because they want to listen to your story, right? Maybe your mom and dad want to listen to your story because they love you, but the rest of the people, your customers, even your team, what they really want to do is listen to your story because they want to hear their own story through yours. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, we do that subconsciously anyways, right? There's some awkward thing and I'm like, can I ask you a question? It's not about me. Let me ask you for a friend, right? Like we kind of always want to do that on our own pace anyway. So context, where, when, who, and the whole goal is to make connection.
Exactly. So once we're able to do that, so that's the goal, right? In the first stage is to create that connection with the audience. Now we move on to the second step, which is the obstacle. The obstacle. So this is, if we're looking at it like a 3-course meal, this is the main plate of any story. There has to be some kind of an obstacle. And when I say obstacle, I mean, a conflict, a difficulty, some kind of challenge, failure. The main character of the story, if you're the main character, no problem. But if the main character of the story does not go through any kind of struggle, doesn't face any kind of obstacle, it's really not worth telling, right? Mm-hmm. And this is one of the biggest mistakes I've seen, even entrepreneurs, especially in the business world, leaders make. This is, they're telling a story and they try to avoid the conflict because they don't want to feel vulnerable. Does that make sense? Usually when you go into the obstacle, especially if it's your story, you're going to have to show vulnerability for that story to have some kind of credibility. So if I'm telling you a story about when I started my business 10 years ago, if I just say, 10 years ago, I decided to leave the corporate world and started my own consulting company. And you know what? Ever since then, I've been super successful and it's great and it's super easy. And if I did that, first of all, you probably wouldn't believe me very much, right? Yeah. And second, it doesn't create any kind of emotion because it actually kind of sets us apart because you're listening to me saying, oh, I'm not like that. That's not my story. Because we all know as entrepreneurs that every single entrepreneur that starts a business has their ups and downs. So I would focus more, especially after I tell you that 10 years ago, I started my business. I would be like, and you know what? My first year, I didn't have any clients. I was knocking doors. I was going to meetings. But since no one knew me and I didn't know how to differentiate myself, no one was calling me back for a second meeting. Now, when I do that, right, there's an obstacle. I'm being vulnerable by sharing that difficulty I had. Now you're much more connected and invested emotionally in the story that I'm telling. Because the purpose, remember I told you each stage has a purpose? The purpose of the obstacle is to create or generate emotion. That's it. You want people to feel emotions. You want them to feel a little bit of sadness or stress or anger, because if people don't feel anything, it's really hard for them to just connect and invest emotionally in your story and want to listen to the rest of the story. So this is, again, one of the biggest mistakes I've seen that entrepreneurs make, leaders make when they're telling stories. They try to jump this part, which is such a fundamental and just key part of any story, because they don't want to go into the vulnerability of it, of talking about maybe they failed. Maybe they, at first they weren't very good. They don't want to talk about that. So they just want to go directly to the success. And any story without, and this is what I believe, any story without a good conflict is not even worth telling.
Yeah, you are so true. Everything you're talking about right now, everything from how to lay out the context to sharing that vulnerable moment. I'm starting to think about the posts that I do every single morning, and I'm like, you know what? I skip that obstacle often. Maybe it's I don't want to look weak. I don't want to look like I made a mistake.
Yeah,
I don't want to look imperfect. But that's how we all are, right?
exactly.
That's exactly where that emotional connection comes from. That vulnerability. All right,
So
what's S?
so remember this principle. Vulnerability breeds credibility.
Mm,
Vulnerability breeds credibility. People are much more credible when they're able to be vulnerable, because when people show vulnerability, it connects us and it shows honesty, right? And we see this like all the time, even in politics. I'm not going to go into that, but we see a lot of times politicians get up and they just talk about how everything is so great and so awesome, and they lose credibility, right? People listen to them like, they're lying, they're not telling the
yeah.
truth. So anything they say after that, we're not paying attention anymore. When leaders, when entrepreneurs are able to show vulnerability, and vulnerability, understand vulnerability in the psychological sense, which means being vulnerable is the ability to show honestly the emotions that you're feeling. That is vulnerability. Society has made us believe that vulnerability is weakness, vulnerability is being poor, right? But the true definition of vulnerability, which comes from psychology, I'm a psychologist, so these are things that I studied, when I was even at the university. Vulnerability is the ability to express or show our emotions.
Mm.
That is us being vulnerable. And when we do that, we become much more credible.
100%. All
All
right.
right.
So what is the S? So
The
we
third,
got
the third
context,
step,
we
right?
got
We're
obstacle.
halfway there. The third step, the third step is the solution.
Mm.
The S, the solution. And this is what we know as the happy ending. Every story, every movie, every series we watch, every book, there's something that's already hardwired in our brain that tells us there's got to be a happy ending to this. Right? The main character might be going through a lot of struggle, through a lot of difficulty. I always think of James Bond movies. There's always a point in a James Bond movie where you literally think like, how is he going to get out of this? Like they throw him in a pool full of sharks and piranhas. How is he going to get out? And we obviously feel emotion, we feel nervousness, but there's something in our subconscious that is like, okay, but he'll get out of it. James Bond's not going to die, right? Because we're always seeking, and we know that no matter what the struggle is, there's going to be some kind of a happy ending.
Mm.
Now, in stories, especially oral stories that we tell, happy endings happen in two ways. One is literally because the main character finds a solution and is able to solve the problem, whatever that problem might be, okay? Or second, they might not solve the problem, but they'll learn something from the situation that they're going through. So I've had people that tell me, look, I have a story, it's really good, but there's no like solution to it. I messed up with a client and we lost a client and we lost, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. And really there's no happy ending to it. I always ask them, okay, looking back at it now, did you learn something from that? Are you different now because of going through that experience? And after reflecting for a few seconds, most people are like, yeah, you know what? I learned that, I have to answer my emails much quicker, or I got to be much more empathetic with my client, or I got to know how to ask better questions. There's always some kind of change that the main character goes through. And change is also a solution. So when we're talking about a solution in a story, it can be literal because you literally solved the problem, or maybe you failed, but you learned something and you became better, or you came out better on the other end. So the objective in the solution part of the story is just to show the change or the transformation that the main character of the story had because of what they went through. Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. Yeah, and it's funny because it reminds me of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
They go I like the hero's two journeys, right? So like one is a physical journey where they're traveling to achieve a goal, but the other one is that emotional journey where they become a completely different person.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of like Lord of the Rings. Frodo's physical journey is to get to Mordor and drop that ring off, but he becomes a completely different person in the process. In whether or not you even achieve the goal doesn't change the fact that you definitely necessarily change those scars are lessons that you wear forever.
Exactly. So I'm gonna pull back the curtains here, and I'm gonna teach you a principle that I want to do it because I think it's gonna add a lot of value to really help you understand, the backbone of stories. But it will also kind of burst your bubble whenever you watch a movie, a series, or a book. Okay, all stories. Now they might have, some might have a little bit different structure, but all stories ultimately, what they're trying to show or communicate is the transformation of or change of a character.
Mm-hmm.
That is what all stories throughout time have always been about, the transformation or change of a character. So when you're watching a movie, when you're reading a book, when you're watching a series, that at the end of this, there's going to be a change or transformation in the main character. That is the structure. Now, I've just shared with you 3. I told you there was 4. So there is a 4th one, and the 4th one is actually what makes all this process really strategic. But up to now, with just these 3 steps, if you apply them, if you understand the principles, you will be a much better storyteller. If you know that, at the beginning, you have to have a context to create connection. Then there's got to be an obstacle to show vulnerability and generate emotion. And then you have a solution to show the change or transformation of the main character. With that, you have a much better story than probably a lot of stories that we're telling, that we're going, through out of the door and the window and the branches, and people kind of get lost when they're listening to our story. Okay. Now, what makes this whole process strategic, because I told you at the beginning, this is strategic storytelling, is the 4th step. And the 4th step, the A, is the application. The application. What does the application mean? The application is now focused on the audience, right? The application is, what is the message or the idea that I'm trying to communicate or convey to the audience through the story that I'm telling? Because what we have to understand, and this is another important brain tattoo or principle that I want you to remember, even though we're talking about storytelling, story is just the vehicle to communicate an idea or a message. The story is just the means to an end. The end is the message. The end is the idea that you want to communicate, and that that if your audience can really grasp it, they can understand it, logically, and also feel it emotionally, it can generate change and transformation in them, right? So if the story is well structured, if the story is well told, and then in the application part, you're able to connect to that story, the purpose or the motive of why you're telling them the story. Now, even though you're sharing a message with them that they probably have heard before, they're receiving it almost as if it's something new. And what we know through brain studies is that when our brain perceives that it's receiving new information, it's much more likely to remember it. And that is why stories are up to 20 times more memorable than just sharing facts, just sharing numbers, just sharing data. And if we're able to tell a story and then connect to that story the message or the idea that we want to communicate, now we're also making our message or our idea up to 20 times more memorable. Because when people remember the story, they're going to remember also the message that we were able to connect, and which meant the application that we wanted them to go through. So the objective, the purpose in the 4th stage is to generate change in the audience. So remember, in the solution is to show the change of the main character, right? In the application, now our focus is, how do we create change in our audience? And that is, like I say in Spanish, la cosa más importante, or the cosa, the most important cosa. Because every time you remember the word cosa, you're going to remember these 4 steps, right? The C is the context. The O is the obstacle. The S is the solution. And the A is the application. And what I just taught you is la cosa más importante, or the most important thing, so you can be a strategic storyteller.
Dude, I know that we could probably go on for hours and go deep dive into this stuff. But honestly, if you spent the last 25 minutes with us, ladies and gentlemen, you just learned something so valuable that you could be the cool guy at the campfire, or you can be the best-selling whatever widget guy at your company, because the story is going to be the connection that you make with the audience. It's going to give them the solution that you're looking for and help them apply what you've taught them. Cesar, thank you very much for coming on the show today, man. If people want to reach out, they want to learn more about what you do, work with you directly, really get schooled on storytelling, how can they do that?
Well, one way is they can go directly to the website, which is actually popping up here. But for people that are listening, it's www.cesarcastro.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm really active there on LinkedIn, always sharing content on LinkedIn. And just so you know, I have a podcast in Spanish and in English. In Spanish, it's called Storytelling Estratégico, which is strategic storytelling in Spanish. It's one of the most listened to podcasts in Latin America. And in English, I just started an English podcast where I think we have 5 episodes up. So for the English speaking and listening audience, go find the Strategic Storytelling Podcast, which is on all the podcast platforms. And you'll be able to learn. In every podcast or every episode, I share little tips, I share suggestions, I share applications, I tell stories, and then I'll show you how I created those. Because my goal, my objective, like I told you at the beginning, is to help people become great storytellers, because I think that we can all be better leaders, better communicators, better entrepreneurs if we become better storytellers.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's the ball game right there. CesarCastro.com, www.cesarcastro.com. Literally go check out his podcast. What better way to learn storytelling than from a storyteller? I mean, Cesar, thank you very much. This is jam-packed 30-minute conversation we just had. And I learned that it only takes one thing, una cosa, and that's all you need to do to be a good storyteller. So thank you very much for coming on the show. Ladies and gents, one more time, scrolling across the bottom, CesarCastro.com, CesarCastro.com. Cesar, thank you very much for being on the program today. Ladies and gentlemen, go out and tell your stories. We're out of here for today. Peace. See you next time.
It's over. Go home.
Is your business in need of marketing? Try starting a podcast.